Hey, welcome to Real Estate Resource. Thanks for stopping by. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell. I really hope you enjoy this video. So today, what I wanted to do was talk a little bit about disclosures because as I do file review and talk to agents and get, the conversations that we're getting and questions that I get. Disclosures seem to usually be kind of a sticking point, right? Whether it be what disclosures am I required to provide, or the listing agent maybe is giving you pushback on providing disclosures that they're required to, or should be providing and they're not, or they're not providing them completely. So I wanted to kind of go through the most common disclosures that you guys are using. Well, the disclosures, period, and then talk a little bit about them so you have maybe some better understanding about how those work and when they're required, right? So one of the things that we won't go over today is the NHD report, because there is an NHD statement that comes from CAR that is a mandated disclosure. But we generally don't use that. We use third-party NHD companies, right, that are bonded, insured, and they do that work for us because most of the information that's required in an NHD statement, your seller really doesn't have much knowledge of. Okay, so quickly too, what I wanted to mention is when you're on the buyer side of a transaction and you have a listing agent or a seller that is either not providing all the required disclosures or not providing the proper ones, there's not a lot we can do other than make the requests for the correct disclosures. Okay, we can't force them to provide them. There's nothing we could do. There's nothing we could do. We can't twist their arm. There is no, there's no legal entity that's going to go to them and say, hey, these things must be provided, even though we know they have to be. So what happens is the conversation then becomes with our client, if we're on the buyer side, that the listing agent / seller is not providing the required documents, the things they're supposed to, or they're not filled out properly. And this is what we were provided, right? And then we have to ask the client, based on what they're supposed to disclose to you and what we've actually gotten as disclosures, do you want to proceed, or would you like to, get out of this transaction and move on? And they would have a right to do that. So that's our recourse, right? I've had a couple of conversations recently with agents on the buyer side where they're having issues with the listing side broker who, and it's usually a lot of people that believe they know everything, right? So that tells you they've probably been in the business for quite a while, that believe that they're not required to provide those disclosures. And generally what happens is the buyer side, our agent that I've been talking to, is mortified that we can't force them to provide the disclosures. And I just want to kind of put that out there, that there's nothing we can do to force an agent to do the right thing when they don't work for us, right? When they're not in our office, can't do anything, right? We just have to kind of work around it, do what we can to protect our clients. And in most cases, that conversation is going to be, hey, listen, we don't know what they know because they're failing to give us disclosures. I'm letting you know that you have every right to walk away from this transaction at this point based on that and based on your investigation period. But if you'd like to proceed, doing your inspections and everything else, then that's up to you. But you need to make that choice, buyer. And whatever your buyer states is their choice to proceed or to back out, then we want to kind of, confirm all that information in an email in an email exchange that they respond to, so that we're protecting ourselves, right? So it would just be like, hey, to follow up on the conversation we had about the disclosures that weren't provided from the listing agent, you've decided to move forward with the transaction. I've told you that you have the opportunity to walk away, to extract yourself from this transaction, and we could go find something else, but you've chosen to move forward. I just want to verify that that's still the direction you want to go. Get their answer back, have that email, put it away in your file, because buyers and sellers, and I'm sure that your buyers are all great people and they love you and you love them, but when something goes wrong, they do get amnesia, right? And so we've got to make sure that we're doing everything possible to make sure that they're protected, and that we're also, memorializing those conversations so that if they do get that amnesia, we can show proof that we're doing our damnedest to protect them. And just so you guys know, that those listing agents and sellers that refuse to provide the disclosures that they're supposed to, if that transaction closes and there's an issue that can be shown to be something that should have been part of the disclosure, that seller, that listing agent, they're more than likely going to be responsible for remedying that issue that wasn't disclosed. Okay, so keep that in mind. So that's, again, a conversation to have with your sellers when they're refusing to do the things they're supposed to do, for us to push. So we'll talk about that a little bit as we go through each one of these disclosures, like, from our side when we're representing the seller and how we make sure that they do the right thing. Okay, so any questions before I share my screen? No? All right, so let's get started here. So the first one we're going to look at today is the fire hardening and defensible space disclosure and addendum. I think what's happened with this one is it became kind of an issue, because I don't think, number one, listing agents don't understand it. Buyers agents don't understand it. So we were getting a lot of, butting heads where buyers agents were requesting this disclosure when it wasn't required. Now, can you provide this fire hardening and defensible space disclosure even when it's not required? Sure. Do you need to? No. I don't know why you would. If it doesn't apply to your property, I don't see why there's any reason why you would be providing this disclosure. Okay? So keep that in mind. With that said, let's talk about when this disclosure is required. Okay? This is right here, paragraph 1, law applicability. If this property does not meet the conditions stated in paragraph 1A or 1B, there is no requirement to complete the subsequent applicable paragraphs. Okay, so we want to go first to 1A and B, and then from there it's going to tell us what we need to do. 1A, home fire hardening disclosure. The notice and disclosure of vulnerabilities in paragraph 2 are only required for sellers of residential properties if the property is 1 to 4 units. The seller has to complete a TDS, and we'll talk about the requirements for a TDS. The property is located in either a high or very high fire hazard severity zone, and improvements of the property were constructed before January 1st, 2010. If any of these 4 conditions is not met, seller does not have to answer the questions in paragraph 2B. Okay? So there's 4 things that qualify the property for being required to provide this fire hardening defensible space disclosure. If one of those things is not true about the property, meaning it's a probate or a trust sale with a trust successor trustee selling it, right? That, or an REO, that would exempt them from a transfer disclosure statement. So right there, boom, I don't have to do it. If the property is not in a high or very high fire hazard severity zone, meaning we would get that from our NHD report. The NHD report is going to tell us, because unless I know as seller, because somebody's come to me from the city or the county and said to me, hey, listen, you're in a fire zone and there's some rules for the property, I don't know this until I get my NHD report. And if my NHD report states high or very high fire severity zone, then I have to provide this form. But if that's not in there, then guess what? I don't have to. If the improvements on the property were constructed before January 1st, 2010. So what that means is when they say improvements on the property, that means that the improvements, like your house is an improvement on your lot, right? So the lot existed, somebody bought that lot, they built a home, that's the improvement. So anything built prior to 2010, right? If my property was built after 2010, I don't have to provide this fire hazard, even if the other 3 items pertain to my property. So remember, 4 conditions, has to meet all 4. If it doesn't meet one of those 4, you don't have to finish paragraph 2. Okay? Now we move to 1B. 1B is the defensible space compliance. Now, could you have two different things, right? Like it's not in a high fire zone, but there is some kind of city or county requirement for a defensible space. Could happen. The disclosure and requirements specified in paragraph 3 are only required for sellers of residential properties if the property contains 1 to 4 units, so same thing. The seller is required to complete a real estate transfer disclosure statement, and the property is located in either a high or very high fire zone, hazard severity zone. If any of these conditions are not met, you don't have to do it. Again, any of those, it has to meet all three. Has to be a TDS, has to be 1 to 4 units, has to be in a high or very high fire zone. Guess what? So if I'm not in a high fire zone, then I don't have to do this form at all, paragraph 2 or 3. Okay? So keep that in mind, because I hear a lot of, I'll get phone calls from our transaction coordinators, from agents. Hey, the buyer's agent is asking me for this form and we don't need to provide it. And the buyer's agents are adamant that it has to be provided. So you have to understand the requirements that fall into place for this to happen. Unless all 4 of those are met in paragraph 1A and all 3 in 1B, you don't have to provide this form. Okay? So here we go. This is if you do have to provide it. Okay? It says, this home is located in a high or very high fire hazard severity zone, and this home was built before the implementation of wildfire urban interface building codes, which helped to fire harden a home prior to 2010. To better protect your home from wildfire, you might need to consider improvements. Information on fire hardening, including current building standards and information on minimum annual vegetation management standards to protect homes from wildfires, can be obtained on the internet website, http://www.readyforwildfire.org. Okay, so here, fire hardening vulnerabilities. Again, like all other disclosures that we're going to go over today, it says, are you, seller, aware of the following features that make the home vulnerable to wildfire and flying embers? The key to that is, are you, seller, aware of the following features? If the seller's not aware, even if the NHD report says, hey, you're in a high fire zone, you have to provide this. Great. It doesn't mean that the seller's going to answer yes to any of these questions. Okay? So are you, the seller, aware of the following features that may make the home vulnerable to wildfire and flying embers? Number 1, eave, soffit, and roof ventilation where the vents have openings in excess of 1/8 of an inch or are not flame or ember resistant. Do you, the seller, know? Answer is probably no, so you're going to check no. Roof coverings made of untreated wood, shingles, or shakes. If you know, yes. If you don't, no. Combustible landscaping or other materials within 5 feet of the home and under the footprint of any attached deck. Do you know? If the answer is yes, you check yes. If you don't know that answer, the answer is no. Single pane or non-tempered glass windows. If you know, you know. Loose or missing bird stopping or roof flashing. Rain gutters without metal or non-combustible gutter covers. So, like other disclosures, this is, are you, seller, aware? If your seller is not aware of any of these things being item that is vulnerable, meaning that they are, just wood shake, or they are missing the roof flashings and things like that. If they're aware of it, then they got to check yes. If they're not, then it's okay for them to check no. But they're still compliant with the idea of providing this fire hardening disclosure. Okay? Now, next section, the defensible space. That's only required if it meets all 3 of the category of the criteria in paragraph 1B. Local compliance. This property is or is not subject to a local vegetation management order and require defensible space around an improvement on the property. 3B and 3C must be completed regardless of the answer on 3A. So whether it is or isn't subject to the local vegetation management ordinance requiring the defensible space, you still have to do the next section, paragraph 3B and C. Okay. If the property is or is not, we got to find out. Is it or is it not? We got to find out. And I'm going to show you, there's a form that came with this that shows you where to go. Okay. Next, we go to B, seller representation of property compliance. With the applicable state defensible space requirement and local vegetation management ordinance, hereafter stated local defensible space law, at the time of seller's signature. Number 1, the default. Seller is unaware of whether the property is in compliance with the applicable state or local defensible space law. Seller does not have a report prepared by an authorized defensible space inspector. So, If I haven't had it inspected, right? If I haven't done that, and I don't know, then I leave it alone. But if I do know that it's compliant, then I would check the box. Property is in compliance with state or local defensible space law, whichever is applicable. If only state law applies, seller must have obtained compliance within the last 6 months. Seller shall deliver to buyer documentation of compliance within 3 days after execution of this FHDS form or the time specified in 3N1 of the agreement, whichever occurs last. If this paragraph is checked, also check paragraph 3C5 below, and we'll get to that. Paragraph 3B3, property is not in compliance. Okay? And now it says, look, if property is not in compliance with the state or local defensible space law, whichever is applicable, if seller has or agrees to obtain a report prepared by an authorized defensible space inspector, seller shall deliver such report to buyer within 3 days after the execution or 3N1, whichever occurs last, right? So it says if seller has or agrees to obtain. If seller has or agrees to obtain. Guess what that means? The seller is not by default required to be the party to obtain that report if they don't already have it. Okay? Now we get to 3C, which is the buyer and seller agreements about all this stuff. Regarding which party shall obtain compliance with the applicable state or local defensible space requirements. Buyer responsibility. No local ordinance. Buyer shall obtain documentation of compliance with the state defensible space law within 1 year of close of escrow. That's if there's not a local, like a city or a county. Then you got to go by what the state law is. Or number 2, buyer responsibility. Local vegetation management order in effect, which requires compliance as a result of the sale of property. The local ordinance allows the seller or buyer to obtain documentation of compliance. Buyer shall comply with this requirement of the ordinance after close of escrow. That's if we know there's a local one. Okay. The buyer responsibility of the local vegetation management ordinance in effect, which does not require compliance as a result of the sale. So some local entities who have compliance, some attach it to the sale, meaning it has to be done as a condition of the sale of the property. Others do not. They just say, hey, eventually it's going to have to get done. You're going to have to, whatever the compliance is, you'll have to figure it out, and you'll have to do it within a year of the close of escrow. Right, so there's 2 different things. You've got to kind of find out which is required. So you do have to do a little work. If it is required, you got to do some work. But guess what? The seller is not automatically responsible. So if I'm listing agent and I know that there's a fire, that's why I've talked to you guys in the past about doing disclosures as early as possible and ordering reports as early as possible. If I'm taking a listing and I think I'm in a fire zone, right? I'm somewhere in the hills, I'm in with a lot of vegetation around the house, things like that. I'm ordering an NHD immediately after I take a listing because I want to know this stuff. I want to know if I have to provide this. And the reason I want to know if I have to provide this is because I want to do the homework to find out what has to be done. Is the report required as part of closing escrow? Is it not? Is there, I need to know all of this. Is there a local ordinance? If not, then it's the state ordinance and we'll follow the state ordinance. Like, I got to know this stuff ahead of time so I'm not negotiating it in the middle of an escrow after I've already accepted an offer. So do a little homework. If you believe that there's an issue with, like, where you're at, you're up in the hills somewhere, you have a lot of vegetation around the property, anything like that, you want to do your NHD report early so you can find out if you're in a high or very high fire zone. And then you want to be prepared for this, right? So I can do as an agent, as a listing agent, when I get offers and I know that this has to be provided, I can make it part of my counter that says, hey, buyer, here is the FHDS already. You're going to be responsible for any of the compliance. You're going to be responsible for that compliance. And here it is. I'm going to tell you in the counter because I'd rather you run away at counter than have to deal with you canceling after the close of escrow or after the open of escrow. Does that make sense? Or we can make it the responsibility of the seller, right? You see here, it's all seller boxes, okay? If the seller's willing to do it. You can write in right here at the bottom, the local agency from which a copy of the documentation, right? So you can show where you got documentation if you have it, okay? Or where to contact, who to contact, where to do it. The The final inspection report, seller has obtained a final inspection. That's if you have one. If you don't have one, you don't check the box. Okay. The seller's going to sign this saying that everything that's in it is true. Depending on how you do it, the buyer's going to sign that they got it. Now, here's some information for the FHDS. Step one, you got to figure out, like, this is just to help you answer questions, right? Is the property located in an area where a local city or county vegetation management ordinance requiring defensible space around the property applies? If yes, right, then you got to go back and do 3A. If not, is not, right, check the is not box in 3A and then go to step 4. If seller does not know, see the next column to find out. How do you find out if your property is subject to it? You can call the local fire marshal. You can contact CAL FIRE at their website, or you can contact your natural hazard disclosure company, which is what we've already talked about, right? Whether or not it's in the very high fire zone. Then here, again, it talks about, does your seller have to report? If yes or if no, it kind of gives you a breakdown of where to go and what to look at, right? It shows you, it gives you an explanation of the FHDS like we just went through, but it has it right here and it comes with it. It comes attached with the form, okay? So here is your reference sheet. If you need to know about the ordinances that exist, once you find out the property is in a high or very high fire zone, then you can go look at CAL FIRE and you can call the fire department in your local community and find out what are the regulations for the property being in that space. Okay. So, and then I guess there's for the inspection, for when you need to do the defense inspector report, you can order that through NHD, I guess is what I'm getting here from Maria, that the NHD companies have that inspector. So questions about the FHDS? Anybody? No, you guys are all clear on it. So what I would tell you is, I just want you guys to know that it's all going to be based on that NHD report if you're in a high or very high fire hazard zone. So again, if you have questions about the location of your listing, that means the earlier you order that NHD report, the better. And if you're a buyer's agent and you get a copy of the NHD report and you go through it and you see that it's in a high or very high and you guys haven't gotten the FHDS, then you can reach out to the listing agent and say, hey, by the way, your NHD report shows that it's in a high or very high fire hazard zone. Can you please provide the FHDS? And if they, push back, you can just, again, your communication and email is, I've requested. They're not providing. I go back to my buyer. Hey, Mr. Buyer, they are not providing the form they're supposed to. What do you want to do? And we follow up with emails like we talked about before, okay? So FHDS is not required on every transaction. There are certain parameters that cause it to be required. So please, please, please make sure you're following those and understanding so you're not getting in arguments with other agents unnecessarily, because I know that happens sometimes over forms that are being provided and not provided. Okay, let's see. What do we got next here? Next up, we're going to do, let's talk about the agent's visual inspection for a moment. All right. Agent's visual inspection. This is the one disclosure that you guys are responsible for. And I know one of the great things that we have going for us here is, on every month or every couple months, every 3 months, we have, someone like Robert Brand, who is an expert in protecting yourself and your client and making sure you're disclosing things properly. And the thing that he focuses a lot on is the agent's visual inspection disclosure. One of the things I always like to remind you guys with the Avid, because agents have a tendency for the Avid to be the very last thing that they provide to a file, right? If you have a transaction coordinator that you're working with, the transaction coordinator is the one that's chasing you down to get a copy of your agent's visual inspection disclosure. Now, I will say that an Avid isn't required by the state of California unless the property doesn't require a TDS, right? So if it's one of the properties like a probate, an REO, a trust sale where a successor trustee is the seller, not the original trustee, right? If it's one of those where a TDS is not required, then an avid is required from the listing agent and the buyer's agent. But if there's a TDS, the agent's visual inspection disclosure form, right, this 4-page form, is not mandatory. It's advised, but not mandatory. Now, here in our office at Center 21 All Stars, we make it mandatory, but other offices may or may not. So, if you're working here and you're working with an agent from outside this company, they may or may not provide you with this avid, and that's okay. You can't fight with them to force them to give you an avid because, again, not required. It's only required here and in a transaction where there's no transfer disclosure. Okay, so keep that in mind. And what this is it's technically part of the transfer disclosure. I'm going to show you the spot. And actually, you know what? Let me open a TDS right now so I can show you exactly where that goes. Because these two forms kind of go hand in hand. So here's a TDS, which we're going to also go over. But if you look at page 3 of the TDS, right, it's page 3, yes. You see here, this section right here, it says Agent's Inspection Disclosure, okay? You can attach your avid form. You could check a box that says that I don't know any items for disclosure, which is crazy. Or I can make my visual inspection disclosure notes right here. And that's why the avid itself is not a requirement, just that you do a diligent visual inspection. So those are your choices, right? I'm not going to do anything. I'm going to give you an avid, or I'm going to write all my visual inspection notes right here in this space, which is not enough. It's not enough space. So let's go back to the avid. So what that means is that your avid is technically a part of the transfer disclosure statement. Okay? It's technically part of the transfer disclosure. Because you work here, you're required to do an avid. And that makes it part of a transfer disclosure statement. Now, if you don't work here in your office, you're watching this video on YouTube, your company doesn't force you to, or doesn't require you to provide an avid, it's still something you should be doing. There's clearly no way that there's enough room on that, 4 lines of space on page 3 of the TDS to disclose everything that you've seen in a diligent visual inspection. And because this is really the only disclosure that you as agent, both buyer and seller, are really 100% responsible for, it's important that you actually do a visual inspection. Because even if there are items that you would assume that everyone saw because you saw them, it doesn't mean you don't have to disclose it. And this is very clear on where I'm doing my disclosures, right? What room I'm in and what I see. So I would suggest everybody use it, even if you're not required to where you choose to work. But here you have to. And because you have to, that form is now part of the TDS because you're checking off the box on page 3 of the transfer disclosure statement that it's included, that's where your visual inspection is. So for all disclosures, those disclosures are supposed to be delivered to the buyer within 7 days of acceptance. So if a listing agent is providing a TDS, right, I'm representing the buyer, a listing agent is providing a TDS and they do it on day 7 and I have not done my avid yet, right, which is supposed to be part of that transfer disclosure statement, and I don't do it until later, and I've had many kind of like butting heads with agents in the past where they're getting avid signed sometimes after close of escrow, I hate to admit. How am I doing my job for my client? How have I provided disclosure to my client and protected their best interest? So what I'm trying to get across to you is your avid should be done, whether you are the listing agent or the buyer's agent, within the first 7 days of acceptance. I'm going to repeat that. Whether you're buyer's agents or listing agents, your avid should be done, signed, and part of the TDS within the first 7 days of acceptance, just like every other disclosure. Because it's only fair that your buyer has all the information all at the same time. Okay? Questions about the delivery of the avid and when you guys should be doing it? Anybody have any questions? Okay. So again, this Avid is just one of my pet peeves. I hate when I see that we have fire files that are closing and these are missing, and we have to run around and go find it and get on the listing and get on the agents to provide it. It's a pet peeve for me. I just think it's something that you guys should be taking a little bit more seriously and getting done right at the beginning. Now, what I will say about the Avid, and we're not going to read all this stuff, but what it doesn't require, right? This is again, it's a diligent visual inspection. You are not a home inspector by any stretch of the imagination. And I don't care even if you're a very experienced contractor or flipper or developer and you know how things are built or should be, or you're able to look at stuff and say, okay, well, that wasn't done properly. That's okay and that's good. But this is a visual inspection. So your visual inspection shouldn't go into diagnosis. It shouldn't go into remedy, right? And I've seen it sometimes on disclosures. Okay, so what you have to do is, if the area is not reasonably and normally accessible, meaning like I don't need to go in my visual inspection, I don't need to go in the attic because it's not reasonably accessible. I don't need to go under the house. I don't need to do a survey of the areas that are off site, meaning I don't have to walk through the neighborhood and figure stuff out about the property. I am not required to review any permits or public records. Okay, if it's a condo, I don't have to go through the common areas and make disclosures about things I see in the common areas. Okay, it's inside the property and it's a visual inspection, which means I'm not required to look under cabinets, turn on faucets. I'm not required to do anything. It's a visual inspection. What I see, the things I see, and the things that I'm supposed to disclose are what I see, and defects. This is about material defects to the property. Okay? This is not your opinion of the condition. This is not what you think is good or ugly or new or old. No. There is no opinions. There is no diagnosis. There is no, opinion on remedy to the issue. It is just what you see, plain and simple. Okay? So when we get into what we're actually writing down here, first of all, if you have 2, 3, or 4 units that you're doing your Avid on, you're going to do an Avid for every unit. So this is unit number 1, unit number 2, unit number 3, unit number 4. You're going to write that unit number in there, and you're going to do an Avid for each one. Okay? Your inspection, this is the firm name. This is the firm name. This is not your name. This is the firm name that goes in here. This is the firm name, so that's Century 21 All-Stars for us because you work here. The inspection date and time. What time did you go there to do the inspection, and what was the date? The weather conditions. Why are the weather conditions important to put on your Avid? Anybody? Nobody wants to volunteer? The weather conditions, the time. Why are those things important for your Avid? Somebody, or I'm going to call on you.
I would say, Kyle, that it's
Yes.
something that the buyer needs to be aware of, that there might be some heavy winds at a certain time of the day. Would that be the answer?
I mean, okay, sure. Moses, what's your thought since you put your hand up?
Oh, okay. You can hear me. The reason being that the weather is so important is because if there is an actual leak in the roof and there was no rain for months, and all of a sudden, you close escrow, a couple months go by and there's leaking, you didn't know because there was no rain. There was no possibility of knowing that.
Yes.
There was no knowing of flooding.
Yes.
There's no knowing of, if you're in a hazard area for fire and it's not fire season, you're not going to know that there's fires.
Okay. Well, I think you're going a little too far. You guys wouldn't know if you're in fire zone anyway, unless you had an NHD
Well, if you
report.
read the NHD.
Yeah, but that's if you're NHD. But guess what? If it's an NHD, you're not putting your Avid. That's a good. I'm glad you brought that up,
Yeah.
Moses, because don't disclose stuff in your Avid that you read in other disclosures, because now it
Okay.
makes you responsible for that information. So don't do that. So
Okay.
even if you see an NHD that says, hey, it's high fire, do not write in your Avid, hey, this isn't a high fire area. Nope. Nope. That is outside of a diligent visual inspection. And so going back,
But like you said, the Avid is just a visual inspection of the current
exactly, but
condition of the
right,
property.
right,
That's
right,
it.
right, right, exactly. So here's the issue. The reason I want to state the time of day is because if there's some kind of neighborhood nuisance, I might be there at noon and there's some kind of a nuisance, heavy traffic, lots of noise, whatever the case is. But if I'm there at 4 or 5 in the afternoon or at 8 or 9 o'clock in the morning, that may not exist. And then with the weather, again, yes, if it's raining, oh, it's puddling, it's an issue. There's a lot of standing water, whatever it is. Conditions of property are different during different weather conditions and different times of day. And if you have somebody else there with you, if the buyer's there while you're doing it, if you have your assistant there while you're doing it, whatever the case is, you're going to put their names down there. And the importance of that is because if there's something comes called into question about what you disclosed, right? Then you have, hey, here was the witness that also saw it at the exact same time, in case you have to get them to.
Right, Kyle. And if you're doing your Avid while a home inspector or an appraiser is there, you should also note that because there's another party there.
Yeah. Okay. We're going to talk about why you shouldn't be doing that. Okay. Do not do your Avid while the home inspector is doing their home inspection. A couple things. The home inspector is probably going to point out some stuff to you that you wouldn't have noticed or known if you weren't doing the Avid at the same time, and you're going to have to now disclose it. Do your Avid on your own. Do it prior to the home inspection. If you go to the home inspections, don't do your Avid while they're doing the home inspection. Do it on your own. And again, do your Avid just like you were looking at it as a visual inspection. The thing is that you don't want to have extra disclosures than what you're required to provide, because then you become responsible for those disclosures you make. So keep it simple. I'm not going to go through every room, but we're going to talk about a little bit, right? Like if I'm walking up to the entry, not the common areas, but the entries, right? That's the porch, it's the front door, it's whatever the issue is. Okay. If there's nothing wrong with that area, I am not going to write in good condition, because that's my opinion. And my opinion of good is not the same opinion of good as your opinion of good. So if there is no issue, because remember, my job is to only dictate the visual inspection, and the visual inspection that I'm writing down is defects, material defects with the property that may change the value or the desirability of the property for the buyer. That's it. So if there's nothing wrong with the entry, if you walk up and it's perfect, there's no cracks, there's no damage, there's no stains, there's nothing, then I'm going to write nothing to note. If you write anything other than nothing to note in there, you're opening yourself up for other issues. Paint colors, things like that. Now, if you feel that it's necessary to put something down, do not again give your opinion. If you want to say carpet is brown in the living room just so you can show that it was there, okay, but I say don't. Just put nothing to note. Okay? Now, if I walk into the living room and there is a giant stain on the carpet, or if there's a big stain in the ceiling, right? Those are the things that I want to start to disclose. If there's a hole in the wall, I want to disclose that, because again, I'm doing a visual inspection of the things I see in that room, and that may reflect poorly on the desirability or marketability of the property. So I walk into the living room. There is a stain on the ceiling. Now I see the stain on the ceiling, and clearly that stain on the ceiling came from liquid of some kind, right? Now, if it's a single-story house, you probably would assume that that's a roof leak. If it's a two-story house, it's probably a plumbing issue, you assume. But that's where we stop, is that we don't assume. So when I see the stain on the ceiling, my Avid says, stain on the ceiling. That's it. It doesn't say water stain. It doesn't say big stain. It doesn't say small stain. It doesn't say water damage. It just says stain. That's it. Someone just put in here, can you complete the Avid during the listing period or do they expire? No, you can. As a matter of fact, if I were a listing agent, I would be doing all my disclosures at the same time at the very beginning prior to marketing the property. So no, the Avid is you're good. The only time the Avid would no longer be valid is if there was some other change, like something happened to the property since the last time you did the Avid. Okay. So if there is a stain, I'm gonna write stain. If there's a hole in the wall, right? We've all seen a bedroom that you walk into and somebody slammed the door open, right? And there's a hole that is clearly from the doorknob because the doorknob fits right into it. In my disclosure, I'm not going to write hole caused by doorknob because I don't know it. I didn't see it happen. Even though we know it, I'm not going to say it. So what I'm going to do is just to say hole in wall. That's it. Hole in wall. Not large hole, not doorknob hole, not small hole, just hole. That's it. Okay? That is it. Again, this is all stuff that is a diligent visual inspection. Like if you're walking on the floor and the floor squeaks or or you can feel that there's a dip, right? You're gonna write just I don't know what caused it, right? So you're just gonna write dip in floor, squeak in floor. That's it. I don't know what caused it. Even if you guys are contractors and know exactly what caused it, for this, you're a licensed real estate agent, you're not going to put it. Okay? So again, don't write looks good, new carpet, great condition. I see this stuff all the time and it drives me nuts. Great condition, brand new paint, new cabinets, No. This is not the MLS. This is not a flyer. This is for defects only. That's it. Defects only. You guys clear on that? Questions about the Avid? Any questions? So avoid going with the home inspector. Do this as early as you possibly can in the transaction. I would prefer that you guys are doing this prior to the first in the first 7 days so that it can be delivered to your buyer with the TDS because it is technically part of the TDS. I want you to do your jobs properly, right? Disclose everything that you know about the property. Now, if for some reason there is something, right, like either something that was specifically told to you, right, like the seller told you, hey, this is an issue, right, and yes, they are going to disclose it or whatever the case is, you could. You could put a note in here per seller, right? Item is blank, 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 blank. But the seller's supposed to make that disclosure. So I would usually leave it to the seller. So if the seller tells you anything that's supposed to be disclosed, then your job is to make sure the seller's disclosing it in the proper place, which would be the TDS or the SPQ. Okay. Questions. So you're going to sign this, right? This is the real estate broker firm, right? This is All Stars. This is you, the licensee, and the date. You're going to sign it. The buyer sign it. I know it says it's not required, right, for the seller to initial it, but I always like to have the seller initial a copy of it just so that they have it. Okay. Even though that's going to the buyer, I want the seller to initial that they've seen what we've done. You're going to sign it again, and then the buyer's agent will sign it if you're the listing agent or vice versa. Okay. All right. Any questions before I move on to the next one? Okay. All right. So let's look at. We talked about a little bit. I'm probably going to save the TDS and the SPQ for next Thursday, but this is a form called the Exempt Seller's Disclosure. So I talked a little bit before about sellers that are exempt from a transfer disclosure. The sellers that are exempt from a transfer disclosure, again, are REOs, probates, and trust sales where the successor trustee is selling the property, not the original trustee. So just to clarify for you guys, because I know sometimes that gets a little confusing. When I set up a trust, right, so I have the Kyle Estrada Family Trust. If I'm still alive, I am the original trustee. And if I sell the property, it is like if I was a regular seller. There's no limitations for disclosure. I have to provide a TDS, the SPQ, the lead-based paint, the whole bit, right? I have to do that. If I were to pass away and I had somebody else on my list, like my son, for example, was on my trust as my successor trustee, and he were to sell the property as a successor trustee, then he would not be required to provide an SPQ or a TDS. He would then use this form called the exempt seller disclosure. And what the exempt seller disclosure does is it's a kind of a condensed version of the SPQ. It's more general questions that you wouldn't have to have lived in the property to have to provide. Now, one of the caveats on a trust, as opposed to a probate or an REO, where they would be exempt from a TDS and SPQ, with a trust, if, for example, my son were my successor trustee and we lived together in the property, he lived with me in that home, and that was his principal residence when I passed and he became the successor trustee, he would still be required to provide a TDS and an SPQ because that was his principal residence for the 2 years prior to him selling the property or me passing away. Okay, but if not, then REOs, probates, and trust sales with a successor trustee, this is the only disclosure that the seller themselves would actually fill out. I mean, there is a lead-based paint that they'd have to provide, but that's really just a signature. And again, the NHD report comes from a third-party company. So the exempt seller's disclosure is just that, hey, it's exempt. And it's, again, the questions are you the seller aware of any of the following? Right? We're not going to read all the California laws and civil codes and all that stuff. This is just, hey, I'm the seller. These are my representations. And just like every other disclosure, it is, are you the seller aware? Right? And if you are, the answer is yes. If you are not, the answer is no. So the first question is, within the last 3 years, the death of an occupant of the property upon the property. So in that case, in a probate or a trust sale, right, or even in an REO, did somebody who lived in the property die on the property? It doesn't have to be the owner. Just did somebody who lived in the property die on the property? Now, if they died within the last 3 years, I have to disclose it. The answer is yes. If I know the answer to be yes, then I answer yes. And if I answer yes to that question, down here is an explanation of any of the yeses above letter K. So everything through A through J, if any of those are yeses, that explanation needs to be made down here. Now, if you don't have space, then you're going to check this little box off and you're going to see attached addendum, and you're going to put all the explanations on an addendum so that you have space. Okay. So here's the thing. With the last 3 years, did somebody that was an occupant of the property die in the property? If the answer is yes, you're going to say yes. So it's 3 years. If it's 3 years and a day, right, it's more than 3 years, I am not required to disclose it unless I am asked. Okay. If the other party asks you, hey, did anybody die on the property? Then I have to disclose if it's outside that 3-year window. Outside that 3-year window, I am not forced to do it on my own to make that disclosure. Now, when I make that disclosure on whether or not somebody died in the last 3 years, I am not required to disclose how they died, how they passed away, unless it was a violent death. And if it's a violent death, sometimes the disclosure will step outside of that 3 years also, or should, right? Just as a best practice. So if somebody was murdered or committed suicide, then yes, that I would have to disclose how they passed. If it was natural causes, if they were ill, they were old, whatever the case was, I don't have to disclose how they died. It doesn't matter how they died. All I have to do is disclose that they did die. Okay? So keep that in mind. Is there an order from the government or health identifying properties being contaminated by methamphetamine? Right? Was this a meth lab prior, and was the government giving me some kind of order that it was contaminated with methamphetamine? If the answer is yes, you check yes. If no, you check no. The release of any illegal controlled substances on or beneath the property, yes or no? Do you know? No? Then check no. Whether the property is located in or adjacent to an industrial use zone, in general zone or a district allowing manufacturing, commercial, or airport uses. Yes or no? You would know, right? You guys have all been in kind of neighborhoods where, right behind it is some kind of manufacturing facility or a lot of commercial use zones, right, that surround a residential home. If you know, the answer is yes. If you don't, the answer is no. It's that simple. Remember, it's, are you the seller aware of? If you're not aware of it, don't try to go figure it out, right? It's not like an investigation like, oh, I don't know the answer. Let me go find out if it is. No. Do you or do you not know? And if you don't know, then you answer no. Whether the property is located within 1 mile of a formal federal state ordinance location. In general, an area once used for military training purposes that may contain potential explosive munitions. It's pretty clear that you would know if you was within a military facility, a mile of a military facility. Whether the property is a condominium or located in a planned unit development or other common interest subdivision. Pretty straightforward. You would know, right? There's HOAs, there's things that are, you know, the answer is yes or no to that one. Is there any insurance claims in the last 5 years? Again, do you know you're the successor trustee? You probably don't know. Or it's a probate or an REO? You probably don't know. Plumbing fixtures that are non-compliant plumbing fixtures as defined by the civil code. That's the water conserving stuff. If you know, yes, right? Yes, there is. Or I don't have any idea, then no, I don't know. And then any other material facts, right? This is it. Any other material facts. Is there anything else that you know about the property that you think would be material to a buyer making a decision to purchase this home? Anything you know about the property as the administrator of the estate, as the successor trustee, as the REO seller, which they know nothing, they're not going to disclose anything. Be prepared for that. If you ever write an offer on an REO, if you get this exempt seller's disclosure on lead-based paint, be surprised. And the chances are this is not going to have anything filled out. And there's, again, nothing we can do about that. Okay. So that's it. Yes or no. Are you the seller aware of it? The seller signs it. You send it off to the buyer. That's it. Now, again, exempt seller's disclosure is not for investors that got the property as an REO, did a flip, and went to sell it. They're not exempt. They still have to do a TDS and an SPQ. Even if they've never lived in the house, they've only owned the house for about a year just to do the flip, they still have to do all the disclosures. Everything. They don't get to use this as exempt seller's disclosure. Okay. So if you're listing a property with an investor of some kind, you've got to be able to be strong with them and say, nope, can't do that. You've got to do these, and these. Okay. If you're a buyer's agent and a seller is an investor and they're like, well, we're not giving you TDS because we didn't live in it, or they write on the TDS, never lived in the property, or they try to give you an ESD, we got to go back to that. We can't force a listing agent or seller to give us something when they don't work for us. We have to then go back to the buyer and say, buyer, you didn't get this, X, Y, or Z. Do you want to proceed? Okay. All right. So we're going to stop there. We will finish disclosures next Thursday. Any questions before I let you guys go?
Me.
Yes, Virginia, go ahead.
So I just recently, we got an offer accepted on a property with solar. The solar is paid off.
Mhm.
I didn't realize that there was a disclosure for solar, but they sent me the solar because I had asked them for the contract. Even though it's paid off, I wanted my client to at least have the information.
Mhm.
But she sent me this I guess disclosure. I haven't seen that. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, I'd have to bring it up, which means I'd have to go to a website and get it. So what I'll do is
maybe on our next training.
Yeah, on next Thursday, I'll get up that disclosure. I'll bring it up so we can talk about it. I'll do that at the very beginning.
So is that whether it's paid off or not? We still need to disclose that.
Yeah.
Okay. All right.
Yeah.
Very good.
And here's the thing: if it's paid off, they don't necessarily have to give you a they should if they have a contract. It shouldn't just be the disclosure. They should give you whatever documentation they have, just like anything else. Right. Anything else that I have, if I have documentation related to something that's being transferred with the property, if I have it, I should provide it to you. Right. It should be like anything else. So yes, they should still, if they have it. If they don't, some people aren't great with paperwork, as we know. So they may not have it, and that disclosure might be the only information they have to provide to you. But we'll talk about that disclosure next week on Thursday.
Perfect. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Anybody else? Anything else, guys? No? All right. Well, I appreciate all of you guys being here. I do. And I'm hoping that this clarified some stuff with you guys about some of these disclosures. Because, again, I know that for us as agents, that Avid is, for some reason, is like our kryptonite. And I know that we also, and Virginia's on here, and she's one of the agents that we had a discussion this week about button heads with the listing agent not providing the proper form. So I know that happens more often than not. Again, so it's just, don't frustrate yourself. Do what you can for your client, and then move on. And try to educate the other party as best you can, but trying to force them to do something is just going to make you frustrated. So I appreciate you guys being here. We will finish with some disclosures next week. Other than that, take care, be productive, and I will see you soon.